are authorized to fire at will.
Hey, I'm TC. This is TC and Friends Monday Night Musings at Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. I am not going to do a real long intro. You guys know me. Some of you are watching who don't know me. Feel free to like, comment, share, subscribe. You'll get to know me if you don't. I do want to share one. This is an unsponsored, unpaid for advertisement for my friend Paula from Rocks and Cows, Paula Christensen up in St. Cloud area Republicans. She is sponsoring a pheasant hunt. Folks, this is the first time on Minnesota Black Robe Regiment that someone hosting a pheasant hunt has ever asked me to throw it out there. But it is going on in, let's see here. She sent me all this stuff. It's the first annual SD14 pheasant hunt happening Saturday, October 7th, 2023 at 8 a.m. to 1:30. And you can go on to Facebook to sign up for that. Please find my friend Paula's sign up. It's at Sandpine Pheasants. And it's breakfast, it's breakfast and a hunt. And Paula wanted me to tell Dr. Jensen he is more than happy to attend if that's his thing. I don't know what he does with all his downtime now that he's not campaigning, besides writing books and legal battles that he's fighting. So, folks, all my contact information is down below. If you're interested in the coffee, send me an email, mbrrpodcast@yahoo.com. If you're interested in any other merchandise, let me know. Here in Minnesota, fall is here, so we're going to have snow next week or tomorrow at this rate. And then we'll have 70-degree weather again, and then tornadoes again in December, the way things are looking this year. But if you need a beanie, I got beanies. So, folks, without any further ado, I'm going to bring Dr. Jensen in, and we're going to get to it. Dr. Jensen, thank you so much for making yourself available for this. I've been looking forward to it since we had our first actual face-to-face conversation back in Rochester. I think it was middle of May.
Well, thank you, TC, for having me on. And I remember the conversation well in May. Rochester was a community that said the election may be 6 months ago, but we still need to be engaging on the topics. And there were people there. It was a full house, standing room only, and there were people there from both sides of the aisle. Mm-hmm. And I think that it was interesting for me as I drove home that night to feel the energy from the audience, their engagement, their concern regarding their state, their concern regarding their nation, and quite frankly, their concern regarding our planet. But I remember very much our interaction and the fact that you're very candid with me, TC. And so when you asked me if I've
had that reputation.
Yeah. So when you asked me if I do a podcast with you, it was easy for me to say yes, because you're exactly the kind of person that I need to be having conversations with. I don't need to be having conversations with people who are saying, oh, Scott Jensen's got it all right, or he's got it all figured out. I need to have conversations with people that will ask me hard questions, put me on the spot, and recognize that I'm just a human being, and I'm right on some things and I'm wrong on some things. And that's really important. And so to your comment about the Rocks and Cows, I'm willing to bet, TC, that the Rocks and Cows, an awful lot of the people who are a part of that and who've been a part of it for the last several years, they didn't see this happening 10 years ago. They didn't see this happening 5 years ago. They didn't see themselves being some gadfly in the world of politics.
Yeah.
For such a time as this, Esther 4:14, they've been put in a role that they hadn't envisioned. And that's the same situation for me. 4 years ago, my life was a whole lot more tame. And I looked at myself as sort of a Jimmy Stewart character in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. But my life has changed dramatically, tipped upside down. I have people that despise and hate me who've never met me. And this is a new experience.
It's funny. I know that feeling. I have the same reaction from people. Some from both sides of the aisle, actually. You say that there's a lot of people who didn't picture even 4 years ago that they would be where they are now. And I mentioned Paula from Rocks and Cows. She's, helps run that organization with Jay Duggan, who, they took the bull by the horns when I affectionately refer to him as Commissar Walls. When he decided he was going to step in and do some of the stuff that he did, and we're all very familiar with what he did in 2020, and he made that comment about rocks and cows, and we all prefer to refer to ourselves as Greater Minnesota because that's really, what we are, in the sense of we make up the majority of the state, even though our population is smaller than the metro areas. And there were a few of us that have been crying, like watchmen on the wall for years, that some of the stuff was coming. But it was very startling to see people come awake and yet at the same time say, how did this happen? Where did this come from? And even politicians, people who not necessarily lifelong politicians in the negative sense, but who had, really should have had their fingers on the pulse of the nation, of the state, of the republic, and the direction that it was going, this completely caught me by surprise. And when I first started catching wind of who you were, when you were just this, lowly senator, I was invigorated by a lot of what you were saying, but at the same time going to myself, he seems like he was caught off guard. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. I think that politicians especially were caught off guard. And I think part of the reason that happens, and I don't consider myself a politician. I ran in 2016, and I had never really envisioned doing that, but I was recruited a year earlier when the Senate seat in Carver County opened up. But so I don't see myself as some savvy politician. I see myself more as generally a naive optimist. And so when I was elected to the Senate, it was a little bit baptism by fire. There were people that were much more knowledgeable than I was, and they were saying, no, Scott, we don't want to talk about this, and we don't want to talk about this. And I was stunned because the first 2 years I was in the Senate, we had the House of Representatives in Republican control and the Senate, and Governor Dayton was not in great health, and he was not what I would call a strong, powerful leader. And so there was an opportunity for us to lead, but I didn't think we led. I think we played it more conservative, almost like when you have maybe a 2-touchdown lead going into the fourth quarter, and you think if you just sit on the ball, you'll win the game. And
you mean the entire Denny Green playbook?
Fair point. But I think we dropped the ball. We contributed to gridlock. And now this past session, we've seen the Democrats flex their muscles, and with the benefit of a triple win, House, Senate, and the governor's seat, they've got the trifecta, and they ran the table. They flexed their muscles, and they were able to keep a 34 majority in line and vote the way they wanted. They did some crazy stuff, but they did some good things too. I mean, quite frankly, why didn't we lead the conversation on when someone who's convicted of a crime has served their time and they're now back in the community? Why wouldn't we want them to engage? If they have a certain amount of probation left, but they're in the community, they're working, they're mowing lawns, they're maybe with the bowling league on Wednesday nights. I think that the Democrats were right to lead that conversation and ultimately say, yeah, we're going to restore their right to vote. We want them to participate. These kinds of conversations we could have led, but we didn't. So it was interesting when I met you, TC, and talked on that evening in May in Rochester. I made the comment that I think the Republican Party and the Republican brand is broken. And I don't think Paula and Jay Duggan 5 years ago thought that they had the kind of time available in their life where they could carve out big chunks of time to lead a movement like Rocks and Cows. And yet they found the time. And I think there are a lot of people that would say the same about me. They said, well, gee, Scott, you're a full-time family doctor, and you're teaching at the medical school, and you're a pilot, and you write books. You don't have time to do this. But I think this is what we do. And you're doing it, TC. We carve time out and we do it. And so when we had that town hall meeting in Rochester in May, what I was struck by coming back that night was that was a bunch of people that were not particularly enamored with labels in terms of Republican or Democrat. They were more concerned that they wanted to see a common sense, independent-minded kind of thinking take place, and they wanted the Constitution to be upheld and, if you will, safeguarded. That's what they wanted. They said, we know what the Constitution says. We've had that for 250 years. It may not be the perfect document, but it does live and breathe in the sense that we have occasionally added an amendment to it. And we think that that's the hallowed ground. It's not that Republicans have all the right answers or the Democrats have all the right answers. It's about being common sense, and we're not being common sense. And so I think that's where we need to go in the future. Is where's common sense and independent thinking going to take us?
Let's touch on that a little bit, because I mean, you ran a vigorous campaign. I'm sure when you look back on it now, hindsight being what it is, there are probably areas where I'm sure you would have adjusted your strategy or game plan. I can't speak to what those may have been, and maybe you want to, but what I have seen from the Republicans in Minnesota in particular, but really across the entire country, has been a lot of hand-wringing over, oh, we've got to win, we got to win, we got to win, and not a lot of talk about what it's going to take to win. Really a lot of talk about what it's going to take to win and how to adjust going forward, because I think we get wrapped up, and when I say we, I'm talking broadly, because I am not affiliated with any party at the moment right now. I'm not in a place where I feel validated. And I know that's one of those fluffy words that, people always imagine people on the left use. But what direction do the Republicans need to go? Because you said something at that event that really struck me, and for lack of better terminology, really won me over to saying, hey, maybe Scott's had a change of heart. And that was, maybe we need to stop identifying as Republicans and start identifying as constitutionalists. And what you said about the crowd coming alive towards the end is true. And I know you did get some pushback, and we'll get to that. But one of the things that shocked me at the same time is a lot of people cling to the Republican mantra. They cling to, I'm a Republican, and whatever Republicans stand for is what makes for conservatism. And I don't think we can say that safely anymore, because we were going to have this big red wave. Minnesota was going to have a red wave. The country was going to have a red wave. And I don't know that motivated people to go out and, let's say if they really thought you were the right candidate for Minnesota as governor, they seemed to be resting on the idea that a red wave was coming and was going to usher you in, because all the rest of Minnesota was tired of what had happened for the last several years. And I think your campaign was a victim, by and large, of too many people staying at home thinking it was a shoo-in because you had the right answers and you were a Republican. How do you see it now?
Let me unpack that, because I think we live in a society that has really gotten in the habit of elevating victimhood or being a victim. So I'm going to push back on that, TC. I don't think I was the victim. I think Greater Minnesota voted in huge volumes. Could it have been bigger? Yes. But we got more votes than any Republican governor candidate ever has. We got a higher percentage of the votes than Tim Pawlenty did in 2002 when he won. We raised almost $6 million, which is more than any Republican governor candidate's ever raised. We had 40,000 unique donors. We had 100,000 people on our email team. We had thousands of people volunteering, and we had rallies that were going on, and people were absolutely energized. So I think that if we were a victim, I think at the harshest level, I think we were a victim of my own inadequacies. I think that there were times where I didn't realize how important it was to be very cautious in some areas. And I think
Give me an example of
well,
what you mean there, because and not to put you on the spot, but you said it was okay. So
well, I'll do two examples. One is, I remember there was a rally in Hutchinson, and before I got to that rally that day, I'd been seeing patients and talking with people in the community, and several folks, I'm not going to name them, but several folks had mentioned to me that they were concerned about what was happening in some of our schools in terms of kids identifying as something other than being a boy or girl. And
right.
There was the whole thing with the furry movement. And I made ill-advised comment during the rally about litter boxes. And I shouldn't have made that comment because I didn't have corroborating evidence. Yes, a couple of people had mentioned it to me that they had heard this or that, but that was not a smart thing for me to do. And I have to own that. I was pestered by that comment by trolls and still am, actually. And, my bad. I apologize. It was indiscreet. Here's another one. I had Republicans trying to accuse me of not being pro-life. So what do you do when you're trying to run for the...
And this is during the campaign?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're all vying for the Republican endorsement. So you sit around with your team and you craft a strategy, and sometimes you say, well, we'll have to outflank them on the right or whatever. And we're seeing that right now with Republican presidential candidates. But I think when we were talking about it as a group of candidates on the Republican side of the ticket trying to get the endorsement, Roe v. Wade was the law of the land as it had been for half a century. And it was always the safeguard, regardless of what you said about abortion or pro-life or pro-choice. Roe v. Wade was there until it wasn't. But in the meantime, I had made comments that probably represented more rhetoric than a thoughtful position on my part. And I think that it was really only in the aftermath of the election that I had a chance to take a breath and do a deep dive into this whole issue. And it's got many, many layers to it.
Absolutely.
And when I did that, we talked about that in Rochester. And I was very candid with people. I said, yeah, I'm pro-life, but I also have come to recognize that there's a lot of other factors there. And I can't say that personally that I believe that the joining of a 23 chromosome egg cell with a 23 chromosome sperm cell necessarily constitutes the beginning of life, particularly if it's happening in a lab, in a petri dish, with those haploid cells being obtained without the benefit of ovaries or testicles, and simply being obtained through driving backwards pluripotent stem cells. So I'm not trying to blow anybody away with scientific jargon. I'm just saying that I don't know, but I do know this. It's really important to me that I have bodily autonomy in being able to say, I don't want to take this vaccine, or I'm not going to take that drug, even though you think it's the best thing for me, for my cancer, whatever. I get to choose. And I think bodily autonomy for me has really risen up to one of those prime factors. And I don't think I spoke as sensitively as I could have. And I think furthermore, as I've really done a deep dive, TC, two things really jump out at me in terms of what are some of the pillars of our democracy. And one of them is the majority rules. And another one is the minority still retains rights. But I don't think that our country was founded on the principle that 30% of the population can tell the other 70% of the population how they're going to live.
And so, vice versa.
Yeah. And yet the minority retains rights.
Yeah.
So when I put all that together, I realized that in this campaign, I could have been more measured. I could have been more, I guess at times, I think I was a rookie and I wasn't a seasoned veteran. And yet I'm not sure, TC, that I want to be that seasoned veteran either, because frankly, a lot of politicians will tell you that what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to deflect, don't answer the question, and drive every question back to 3 topics that you feel really comfortable about, regardless of what the question is. If someone asks you what the price of beans in is Africa, answer the question about energy or something like that. And so, I think that when I look back, we did a lot of good things, but we could have done better.
So let's talk about this, because that was the area in Rochester where you got a lot of pushback. Like everybody that came to the mic seemed to come up and want to challenge you. And you've been a man who's not been afraid to, share your Christian beliefs. You quoted from Esther tonight already. It's a prominent part of your profile page, or when you sent me your bio, it's certainly a prominent part. It shows the churches you've been a part of. And you stated without any equivocation that you are personally against abortion, that you are personally against it. But, and I think what you alluded to that day is that ultimately it's a state rights issue, which is what the Supreme Court decided, is that this belongs back in the hands of the states, which is really what a constitutionalist position should be. And everybody was very upset because you wouldn't come out and say that there needs to be a law written by the state of Minnesota or by the federal government that flat out bans it, which is really what the entire argument was about. And, and when I spoke up, I said, look, I'm an abolitionist. I despise abortion. I absolutely despise it. But I believe it's a state rights issue as well. And, you've talked a little bit about reflecting on, from your campaign until now, from that meeting back in May to that town hall meeting back in May to now, about reflecting. And this is one of the things that I was reflecting on after I heard you speak and after I heard the pushback. And so what I'm saying, by the way, so everybody knows this is just me. I'm not speaking for Dr. Jensen. I'm not speaking for anybody else. I'm speaking for me. What I see from a lot of people who wear the label of Republican, put that R behind their name, and they vote, like you said, we have to stop making it the primary litmus test for candidates and whether or not they're going to be the right candidate for us. The issue is that we all want to be pro-life. We don't want to see any babies die in utero. But that requires work. It really absolutely does require work. And by and large, we're a pass it on people. We want to pass that work on to somebody else. And quite frankly, abortion ministry, abortion counseling, whatever you want to call it, pro-life counseling is hard work, and it's ugly and it's unpopular. And a lot of people just want it to be a law that says you can't get an abortion. And now the child is protected, and now I don't have to do any work because we got the right people in office to make it a law that it's illegal for you to do. And now I don't have to go out and stand there and ask people, hey, please, would you reconsider? Would you come over here and listen to what we have to say? We're going to offer you some options, adoption. I've done ministry with a church several years ago that literally had money. They had money in their coffers, basically, to adopt every single child that they tried to save at abortion mills. But they were unpopular with other conservative churches because they were standing out in front of abortion clinics, pleading with people, let us adopt your baby. And so they got a bad reputation from other churches for that. And I think that's what we're facing, is it's so much easier to just say, no, pass a law so I don't have to look like a weirdo when my friends see me standing outside of Planned Parenthood or standing outside of some other clinic, because I don't want my friends and my coworkers to think I'm one of those types of people. Well, those types of people are doing work that a law is never going to change. A law is never going to change that. And I think that's why you were getting pushback, honestly, that day. It's easier for people to go, oh yeah, pass a law so I don't have to do it.
Yeah, let me unpack a couple of things you said. First off, I think you're spot on. I think the Supreme Court did not say we are pro-choice or we are pro-life. The Supreme Court said that within the Constitution, they don't find the substance necessary for Roe v. Wade to be justified. Now, we've had both liberal and conservative Supreme Court justices come and go. Ruth Bader Ginsburg comes to mind right away, that have said the same thing that this Supreme Court in 2022 said. That I think Ginsburg said that it was one of the worst examples of jurisprudence, is that for that 73 court to literally find within the Constitution the grounds for that when it's not there. In 1989, the Rehnquist led court was on the verge of reversing Roe v. Wade, but did not. The bottom line is the Supreme Court said it's a states' right matter. And if you're a constitutionalist, I think, at least in my book, we really need to stand strong for states' rights. We need to recognize and hold to the fact that if it isn't specifically given to the feds, it's ours. And I think that's why I feel like we need to have these states have a chance to do it. That'd be the one thing I say. The other thing I said that night is, and this gets to your point about the hard work, not just virtue signaling, not just check the box, we passed a law.
That's right. That's what it is.
But let's talk about, can both sides, both pro-life and pro-choice, can both sides agree that not many people go through their childhood and teenage years hoping that someday they might be able to have an abortion? I don't think that happens. I think abortion is a consideration that comes up in circumstances that aren't necessarily to a person's choosing. So I would say, what can we do to make the need to consider an abortion a less necessary consideration? And to me, it would be, let's share the responsibility for family planning, men and women. That means we can subsidize birth control pills as a nation. Let's keep it less than $5 a month. Let's make it over the counter. There's no reason why a young woman should have to go see a doctor and spend $300 every year on a physical exam and pap smear, which medical data shows doesn't provide any particular benefit. Let's not do that anymore. Most first world countries allow birth control pills over the counter. Let's have the morning after pill in the medicine cabinet next to the Tylenol bottle. Nobody wants their life turned upside down because a condom broke or they had a sexual encounter they hadn't anticipated having. Let's streamline adoption. There's no reason adoption should cost $100,000. Let's make it easier. Let's teach natural family planning to young men and young women in high school so that they understand cycles and things like that. Let's continue to do research into male contraception as well. But there are things we can do. But I think that, to me, one of the real bellwether moments in 2022 occurred in August, 2 or 3 months before my election. And that was Kansas. Kansas is a conservative state, a red state, a pro-life state. Kansas had a ballot initiative on at their election in August. They could ban abortion. This was a pro-life state. That ban lost almost 60-40. And to do the math, the only way that could happen was a fair number of people who were personally pro-life did not feel comfortable imposing that pro-life position on Kansas as a whole. And so they did not pass this ban. I think there's many, many people at that point. I challenged the audience, and you probably remember this, TC. In Rochester, I said, listen, if we did things my way and we had birth control pills less than $5 a month over the counter, the morning after pill in the medicine cabinet, streamline adoption, I think we could take the 10,000 abortions done every year in Minnesota. We could bring that number down to 5,000. But I think what we've done is we now have abortion up to 39 weeks. And we have people from other states coming to Minnesota so that we're going to have 25% more abortions this year than we've been averaging over the last 5 or 10 years. We're going to have over 12,000 abortions. I would say, who's pro-life here? Your way, which kicked it up to 12,000, my way, which may well reduce it to 5,000. Now, if we're really talking pro-life, don't we want to reduce the number of abortions necessary? And doesn't that mean that we could come together and say, let's work together? And if we did that, then couldn't we devote some time to what are we doing to our Constitution? What are we doing in this nation where it seems like we're grooming the next generation of chronic politicians who, once they get there, it seems like their first priority becomes their next election? Is this really the path that we think is sustainable for America and for Minnesota? Because we're not talking about inflationary policies. We're not talking about how do you reduce crime and have some reasonable level of law and order in a compassionate way. And how do we educate our kids more effectively so that they're getting a foundational education, not an indoctrinational one? I mean, to me, these are things that I'm hearing people want to talk about. But we're so stuck on one or two purity tests that we're not getting to these issues.
You know, one of the things that you said in there, it's a very libertarian position, and I recognize it because I run in those circles. A lot of the people I talk to are very, very libertarian. People here in the Minnesota Libertarian Party and people around the country who are adamantly pro-life, who are saying a lot of the same things. Who, by the way, you can't get any more small government than the Libertarian Party that exists today. And they'll tell you, like, no, we need to stop spending taxpayer dollars on a lot of things. But one of the things they talk about is pregnancy prevention to help shrink the numbers, and then intervention through private organizations for adoption and to make adoption more affordable. And what I hear in the back of my mind, coming from the perspective that I held for a long time, was, but Scott, that's not small government enough. Because you're talking about subsidizing, and when you subsidize, that's coming out of somebody's pocket. The federal state and the state never subsidize anything without taking it from you and I. But I'm over here saying, okay, folks, listen to what we're talking about here, which is what you said is we want to stop. We can have the moral conversation all day long about teaching abstinence. We could talk about immorality of sexual contact and behavior outside of the confines of marriage, whatever you want to say. We could talk about that all day long, but the reality that we deal with, the reality that we live in our state and in our nation right now is, even in heavily red states, all of that stuff doesn't get talked about. It doesn't get talked about. We have a culture of, if for lack of better terminology, of promiscuity. We have political candidates that brag about their promiscuity. Like, they're not afraid of it. How do we then expect the people to not also have the same perspective? And then you turn around and go, by the way, I'm pro-life and I want to crack down on abortion and I'm going to end it under my watch. That is going to send a lot of people running the opposite direction when the person who's saying it's life doesn't reflect the value that they're espousing.
Let me go back to the faith that you heard me and mention that is a profound influence in my life. Jesus once confronted someone, said, "Why are you so concerned about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you've got a board in your own?" If you want to talk about promiscuity, the dismantling of the nuclear family, and the widespread increase in divorce, you shouldn't be blaming Gen Xers, Millennials, or Gen Zs. This is the baby boomers. This is my generation. This is Woodstock in '69. If you want to talk about the free love movement, if you want to talk about a very obvious transition from one set of values to another, that happened as the baby boomers went through that aging process of 25 to 65. We saw so many societal norms fractured on our watch. So I think it's very reasonable for Gen Xers, Gen Zs, and Millennials to say, we've had enough of that. Why do you tell me that you want small government for yourself, but you want bigger government for your neighbor? You don't want government intruding on your life. You don't want government telling you that you have to take a vaccine, but you do want government telling your neighbor that they can't do this or they have to do this. And I think that's where a lot of young people are at. I mean, I think at some point in time, TC, I think it's going to be important for the Republican Party and conservatives and constitutionalists and perhaps all parties, but I would at least identify constitutionalists and Republicans. And I would say, why do people join something? Why do they join the Lions Club? Or why do they join a church? Or why do they join a political party? Or why do they join a bowling league? And I think there's an answer. And I think people join things first because they own the mission of that organization, whether it's they own the values and the mission the church professes. Maybe it's a Lions Club and they feel it's really important to give back to the community and to do things collectively that couldn't be done individually. Maybe it's joining the Chamber of Commerce and they own the mission of businesses coming together can make each other stronger. But in a political party, they own the mission of what they think that political party stands for. All right, so why am I a Republican? Well, for me, I became a Republican on my own as an adult during the Reagan years, because I thought that that man stood for the values of faith and family and freedom. I thought that he respected the wisdom and the works of the founding fathers. He wanted limited government. He wanted lower taxes. He wanted to honor life. He wanted to celebrate exceptionalism wherever you saw it. He wanted to always safeguard individual liberties and not have government intruding on them. He felt that communism was a failed experiment, and he thought that we get peace by being strong, not by begging for it. And at the end of his speeches, so often he would challenge us to be like the bright, shining city on a hill. That's why I'm a Republican. It wasn't because I wanted to pick out 2 or 3 purity tests and make sure that everybody checked those boxes correctly in order for me to get on board. So I know why I joined the Republican Party. I know that I own the mission statement as I see it. And that was the 1980s. Why else do I join things? I join things only if I have the freedom to differ. If someone tells me I've got to give up my own independent thinking, I've got to participate in this echo chamber groupthink, and I've got to be on board 100% of the time, I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to take a pass, because I'm really sort of a fan of Ronald Reagan when he said, if you agree with someone on 80% of the issues, you don't have a 20% enemy, you've got an ally. And I buy into that. So why else do I join things? Well, I join things because of fellowship. If I join some, I want to have some fun. I want to have some commonality. I want to walk out of a meeting with Joe or Jane or Bill or Tricia and say, that was stimulating. That was quite a meeting. And another reason why I join things is I want it to be educational for me. I want to grow. I want to learn. So if I'm going to join maybe a bowling league, maybe I want to learn how to bowl better, and I want to be with people that bowl regularly, and maybe they can teach me how to release the ball better and get more strikes. But lastly, TC, if I'm going to join something and stay a member of it, it has to be relevant. If it's not relevant, I don't want to waste my time. And frankly, that's why I think the Republican Party is at a crisis. I think the Republican Party would have an easier time getting people to vote for their candidates if their candidates had a C in front of their name for constitutionalist than an R in front of their name. People are tired of this broken brand of republicanism that picks out 1, 2, or 3 litmus tests and says, check the box or you don't have my support. You watch the Democrats in the last 60 days before an election, they will come together, they'll put their ideology aside, and they'll say, let's go win an election.
Yep.
That's a huge difference.
Well, and I've been saying this, quite a while, that the biggest difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, whether it be at the national level or at the state level or local level, for the most part, is really the form of tyranny that they want to impose. They don't like me when I point it out, but it's just true. It's 2 sides of this, it's different sides of the same coin. The Republicans will scream bloody murder because of the tyranny of the left, because they want to do this, this, and this, and this with my life. And then the Democrats will scream bloody murder because of the tyranny of the right, because they want to do this, this, and this, and this with my life. And what they both want is to have the power to inflict their purposes on everyone else because they have the power. And I think that's what we see playing out. And that's why I do believe we're starting to see not a resurgence, a surge in people showing interest in parties like the Libertarian National Party, especially with the changes that they've gone through in the last year and a half. And why you're starting to see even people within the Republican Party courting the Mises Caucus, which now has a Republican wing to it, and not just within the Libertarian Party. And because the language you're using is they're again very much classical libertarianism, paleo-libertarianism, which is, no, it's the Constitution. We want the Constitution for ourselves. We want the Constitution to be this bulwark against tyranny, against government overreach for us. Then we have to be consistent in its application across the board. It can't be just, oh, I'm a conservative and I want the Constitution to protect me. We have to even be willing to say, this is a states' rights issue, and if my state chooses to go this direction, I have a right to be against it, and I have a right to speak against it, but I've got to address that from a personal perspective and not just bring me a law, no matter what the issue might be.
You make a very good point, TC, and you used several words that I think are important to highlight. You said, if you're going to buy into the Constitution, you have to buy into a consistent application of it. And I think that's really important. And I think that's a big part of the problem with both major parties. I know that we have limited time available, but I'd like to just take what you said and use it as a segue to, I wrote a book called We've Been Played, and it's available if people want to buy it at drscottjensenbook.com, DrScottJensenBook.com. It's $20. And in it, I talk about that triad of tyranny of big government and big tech and big pharma and how their interests collude. But specifically, big government wants big government, and they want more of it. So, for instance, I think one of the worst things that the Democrats did in Minnesota this past legislative session was they made it harder for anybody other than a Democrat or a Republican to get their name on the ballot in the November election. When I was in the Senate, I worked with the Libertarian Party and the Independent Party and the Green Party. I wanted to make it easier.
Yes.
Because I think that our two-party system is at least at some level fractured. Now, whether or not that fracture can be realigned and allowed to heal, I don't know. But I think if it isn't able to be healed, our only salvation may well be that third party, that party that hasn't enjoyed the kind of money, stature, and history that the major two parties have. But the Libertarians, the Independents, the Greens Party, the Peace Party, the Marijuana Party, these parties oftentimes have been willing to lead the hard conversations and not deflect on issues because they're fraught with danger in a political campaign. So when the Democrats made it more difficult for the Libertarians or the Independents to get a person on the ballot in November, it's more difficult in Minnesota than it is in Iowa, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, and the great majority of the states in our nation. To me, that was one of the worst things that happened this last session, because what it does is it almost paralyzes our ability to heal.
I know we've only got a couple of more minutes, but I wanted to ask you just, briefly, how are things progressing for you as far as, I know you can't get into too much detail, but you have some legal battles that you are fighting at the state level as it regards the Attorney General. And I'm a realist. I know just how much protection exists because of, I'm going to use the broad brush of qualified immunity. And as you know, that applies to so many people. It's like everybody's like, it's just for cops. I'm like, no, it's not. It's not. But when you take on the state, City Hall, you never fight City Hall because you can't win, but that's not true. But you're fighting some battles now because of the attacks on you over the issue of the Constitution and your freedom of speech. And so you're taking on a few people at the state level. Can you tell us a little bit about that and where that's going and how it's looking for you?
I sure can. And I would say that one of the linchpins of the entire COVID-19 pandemic in terms of government expanding its role and utilizing executive powers always boiled down to censorship. And at some level, when you encroach or squash someone's First Amendment right to speech, you are censoring them. And so I have told people across the nation of what I think, and people have absolutely agreed. So here's what my case says. I'm saying I get free speech, but I understand that the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice has the right to monitor me and adjudicate my actions in regards to my professional conduct as it relates to the practice of medicine. So in other words, if you're in the office seeing me as a patient and I have a bias that is not grounded in scientific principle, and I tell you something that's patently false and it affects your health, and you tell the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, Dr. Jensen denied me the opportunity to have this. Dr. Jensen told me that there is no such thing as a tetanus vaccine. So I took him at his word, and then I got tetanus. And then I found out there is a tetanus vaccine. In a situation like that, the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice absolutely has the right to judge me. But if I'm talking to a group of people and they're not patients of mine, and there's no relationship with them, I'm on the Senate floor, I'm running for governor, these are people who've never met me, then I get free speech. I'm not giving medical advice. I'm giving my opinion as a citizen. That's
educated as it might be.
Yeah, that's a huge piece of our case. The other part was the Board of Medical Practice decided that they had the right to judge me simply because I was called a name. It's called an ad hominem attack. Yep. So someone would write to them and say, Dr. Scott Jensen is a reckless doctor. And they say, he said masks don't prevent COVID-19. I said that in a public speech. Actually, I don't know anybody who would disagree with that statement. The question would be, can wearing a mask mitigate your chances of getting the disease? But do we think that a cotton mask can absolutely prevent someone from getting the disease? No. I mean, I think the studies have been demonstrated all over. But the ad hominem attacks that are thrown at me don't necessarily warrant the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice taking that on. They could have just dismissed that in my book. And that's what we're trying to get. And when I get at that, TC, what I'm saying is I don't see myself as the arch enemy of the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. I think, frankly, our state statute doesn't give the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice enough latitude and discretion to just simply dismiss complaints. The Minnesota Board of Medical Practice operates under the notion that if a complaint comes in, they got to initiate an investigation. Well, in that way, we've seen that board weaponized because there are people who want to make my life a living hell. They want to shut me up. They want me to be so overwhelmed by my legal problems with the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, I won't bother saying anything more.
Or you'll give up and go away.
Yeah. And I think the other piece that needs to be recognized is that we're seeing courts and organizations walk things back. Take, for instance, repurposing drugs. Recently, we had the FDA in testimony say that no, they never said physicians couldn't use ivermectin. Well, that's not what the public heard. So we're seeing that as a part of our case. And we're talking about the chilling effect of what the FDA did to physicians and patients. And then we have to get to the separate lawsuit I have against Keith Ellison. And that's because Keith Ellison said he's going to hold himself above the law. We have a Data Practices Act in Minnesota, which is sort of a twin sister to the FOIA federal act. which allows the public to receive information that should be public. We have asked for all the emails and correspondence that's come through the Attorney General's office regarding Scott Jensen. We want to know. Well, Keith Ellison has said in documents submitted to the court that he's not going to do that because he thinks that if some of the things that came across were put in front of the public, it might cause his staff to be hassled. Well, I'm sorry. He doesn't have that kind of unilateral power. So we're suing Keith Ellison on that. And finally, TC, I think one of the grave errors that our society has made through this whole 3.5 years of COVID pandemic is to not understand with more precision the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is simply the information you believe to be true today ultimately not being true.
Right.
Disinformation is a totally different animal. Disinformation is generally defined as a deliberate attempt to deceive with either half-truths or high-sounding falsehoods.
Gee, that sounds like everything from 2020 until now.
Yeah. I mean, just take, for instance, how many years did I tell my patients to not eat eggs because it might raise their cholesterol? Well, ultimately, now that's proven to be false. We now tell our patients, go ahead, eat eggs. Was that a disinformation effort on my part? Of course not. Was it misinformation? Yes. In the 1980s, I told my patients, cut back on your eggs. In the 2020s, I'm saying there's no real data that says that eggs are the problems. We did the same thing with aspirin. Turn 40, take an aspirin a day to keep the doctor away. Well, we found out that that really doesn't stop heart attacks, but it does cause a fair amount of gastrointestinal bleeding. So we don't tell 40-year-olds just because you had your 40th birthday, start taking an aspirin every day. Was that disinformation? Of course not. Was it misinformation? Yes. We need to be more careful between those two words because they're tossed around ballyhooed just to poke at someone. And that's not going to solve any problems.
And just so everybody knows, if you're local to me and you need eggs, I may or may not have unauthorized backyard chickens and a plethora of eggs. I may or may not have those. Dr. Jensen, I know that we talked about 45 minutes, and so I want to respect that and honor your time. But, you know, I said this to you when we met. I was pretty darn hard on you from, just a few things couple of things that I saw. And, I even questioned you a little bit about the comment that you made about Kim Potter. And that was, that's one of those things that you said we could disagree on something. We can have a variance of opinion on something, or even a, deeply philosophically divided perspective on things. But what I want people to hear from me, is that having a platform like this, or having a platform like yours, which it's far more vast and far more important than anything that I'm doing, is that reaching out to that person, not even across the aisle, but maybe sometimes the person who's standing next to you on the same side of the aisle, who has a lot of the same perspectives, and saying, hey, look, we disagree on this particular topic. And we can maybe even have heated conversations sometimes about those disagreements and work through those. And sometimes it's just me having the conversation and you don't know that I exist, which is, pretty par for the course for me. But it's getting to that place where you're willing to talk about those differences, finding those places where we agree, and going forward and saying, how then can we take those agreements, intertwine them, and move forward for the betterment of the Republic as it regards all of us? Because my goal as an individual, and I say this with some certainty, your goal as an individual is, at the same time, not just the betterment of the people who agree with us, but what's good for the people who are adamantly opposed to us. If we are this convinced that we are right on a particular topic, then our goal should be to convince our neighbor who disagrees with us, the person down the street, the coworker, whoever it might be, come along with us for this ride, for this journey. And what both parties, the uniparty, we hear that language all the time. What both parties need to do, the Dems and the Republicans, is they have to stop being so focused on beating the crap out of each other that the victim, and I know I don't mean that in the victim mentality, but the actual victim of that fight always ends up being we the people. It always ends up being we the people. We're always the ones left hurting. And so what I heard from you that day back in May was a strong shift away from, I'm a Republican, gosh darn it, and I'm going to espouse every Republican line no matter what, because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. What I heard was what matters is the Constitution and what it does for we the people. And I want to commend that, even though it's, there might be some areas we disagree on a few issues. I commend your perspective on that. And I hope that you're able to take the platform that you have with the notoriety that you have and the support that you have with people and drive home the constitutionalist perspective. Because that to me is far more important than whether or not a person is a conservative or a libertarian or a progressive or a leftist. Please, Dr. Jensen, do not drop that ball. Do not give up the fight on making this a constitutionalist fight. Because if there's any hope in saving this republic or even rescuing, the people's state of Marxisota, if there's any hope at all, it's in getting back to the Constitution. So I commend you for that and being bold enough to say that to a group of people who might think they agree, but then all of a sudden realize what the reality of that might mean they have to be willing to reach across the aisle and make friends with enemies.
Well, thank you, TC. And I guess my closing comment would be, I'm not an attorney. I never studied the Constitution in depth like you might in law school. And it's never fun to invest 2 years of your life and a lot of energy into something and lose. But in the aftermath of losing, I had the chance to do a deeper dive into what has been the sustaining force in our country for the last 250 years. And what does really matter more
Sorry,
than
I lost you for a second.
no.
What matters the most?
What matters to me the most in terms of sustainability. And in the process, I fell in love with the Constitution. I read it from cover to cover. I memorized the preamble. I've tried to read why each amendment was put in place, why this article is there. And it's a remarkable document. And it's given us a path for us to weather incredible challenges to us. I mean, slavery and the Civil War and 2 world wars and the Vietnam War and the fact that the country was so divided and we had so many young people die. And somehow we found our way through this. And it was because not the Democratic Party did it or the Republican Party did it. It was because the Constitution and the 3 branches of government somehow muddled their way through the challenges and the crises that we experienced. And here we are today. And I think that we would be ill-served if we think that now we've gotten to some greater plane where it no longer needs to be the Constitution that drives our republic. Instead, it can be the Democratic House or the Republican Senate or vice versa, or the president, or we can denigrate the Supreme Court. This is not the time to diminish the respect we have for the executive, the judicial, the legislative branches, but all 3 always being held to the Constitution. And so I'm absolutely confident, TC, that if I do anything further in politics, I'll do it with a refreshed, far deeper appreciation for the Constitution. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. I know that you got to get going. You probably have like 14 more pages to write in your next book or something. So,
Well, let me give you a scoop. I
oh,
haven't
is this
said this
is
on
this the
any-
first time?
First time on any of it.
Oh,
My wife had major surgery this morning. She got a new knee. She's doing great. I spent the day at the hospital with her. I came home so that I could do your podcast with you. And tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, I'll be back in the hospital with my wife. And people have asked, how's she going to do? She's doing great. Thank you for your prayers and thoughts. But it's on the TC Pearson podcast that I announced that my wife's doing great.
well, I will take that. That's the best scoop I've had some scoops, but that is literally the best one, because anytime you can announce that someone in your family is doing better after having gone to a hospital lately, that's but uh I I'll let you go so you can go get some rest so that you can go and be with your wonderful other half and again tomorrow. If you want to hang out and listen to the close, I'm not going to say anything radical, but I certainly will let you do that from behind the scenes, or you can catch it, on the replay uh, whenever you want. In fact, I'd love it if you'd share it. I'd love
Send me
some
the link.
traction. They've already demonetized us because I can't imagine why. So, but Dr. Jensen, Scott, thank you very much for your time. It says a lot about you that you've come to a place where you're still willing to make appearances like this. And like I said, the platform that you have is going to do far more than this ever will, what I do ever will. So I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate the ability to work this out with you so that we can uh, have this conversation going forward. And if you ever think of anything else that needs to be talked about and you'd like to do it, let me know.
I will do that, TC. Thank you so
And
much.
my best to your wife.
Thank you.
Folks, the former candidate for governor here in the state of Minnesota, and no matter what your perspective might be, I can guarantee you, we all know we would have been much better off with Scott as governor than what we have been this go around. And now that is not meant to be derogatory. Scott is definitely better than Tim. Now his competition isn't real stiff, mind you, but we are where we are, folks. I want to touch back on something here in my closing thoughts, and I want to talk about the abortion issue. I want people to understand I am literally an abolitionist when it comes to abortion. I absolutely want to see all abortion end. But when I say that, I want to reference another abolitionist in the history of the United States, and that abolitionist was Lysander Spooner. Lysander Spooner was a Northern libertarian. He was a libertarian philosopher, and he absolutely despised the institution of chattel slavery in North America. You want to know what he wasn't willing to do, folks? He wasn't willing to go to war on that issue. Not only was Lysander Spooner adamantly opposed to chattel slavery, he was also adamantly opposed to going to war with the Southern states, with the Confederate states, on the issue of secession, because he recognized that it wasn't just about slavery. He recognized that it was a states' rights issue. And he has a really powerful quote, and I'm gonna share this with you, and I'm gonna paraphrase it. If you guys want to know who he was, I would strongly recommend you go and dig into his writings. He said, and I paraphrase, that the Constitution is either directly responsible for the form of governance that we have now, or it is wholly inadequate as a piece of paper to prevent the kind of governance that we do have. Now, we could have a lot of conversations about Lysander's view of the legitimacy of the Constitution, but what we do have to recognize is that we have dropped the ball on holding people accountable for the Constitution. And we have failed. We have Chad Catter who's watching, and he could give us all a class. I'm going to be bringing Chad on here in the very near future before the end of the season for TC and Friends Monday Night Musings. We could have a lot of conversations. But one of the things that we have to do is we have to get back to holding people accountable to the oaths that they swear and not letting them dodge the bullet of the question, where do you stand on the Constitution and where do you stand on the natural rights of man? Folks, if Lysander Spooner could be an adamant, ruthless abolitionist when it came to his view of how wicked and evil chattel slavery was, you can be an abolitionist when it comes to abortion and recognize that the argument that we're going to have, that we need to have, is not about whether or not you're going to throw somebody in jail for having an abortion, but whether or not you're willing to walk across the street and have the conversation with that young lady and the young man who are going in to have the abortion. Have that abortion. That is where we need to be having this conversation. And we need to be consistent in our constitutional adherence. It's either for all of us or it's for none of us. And if it's not for any of us, then none of us are protected. Do you understand? And I will stand shoulder to shoulder with Dr. Jensen and fight the constitutionalist argument, or have that argument with anybody who distracts from it or detracts from it any day. Any day. The sovereignty of the individual state absolutely overrides the ability of the federal state to reach down and tell anyone how to live their life. That's how we should be governing as we the people. And that should be the goal, the end goal of anybody who's running to be an elected servant of we the people. How can I least infringe on the natural rights of man? And so far, the Uniparty is not interested in that. They're only interested in the power that comes with the office. And we, the people, as my background on here on StreamYard will show you, we can remove the government chains. But you have to be willing to fight. Now, are you? So until next time, my friends, fight for your liberty. It is yours. Fight for your freedom. It belongs to you. And Sic Semper Tyrannis.
We are going for liftoff in T-30. Stand by for further instructions, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. Secondary guidance systems engaged. Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, it will be on my mark. Regiment, you are over the target. You are authorized to fire at will.